Hello and welcome to my Dominion 6 guide for Pretender design. In this part we'll go through blesses and where and why they're useful for your blessed troops, blessed priests, and mages in your Pretender. So what are blesses? Blesses are the additional power that come from your Pretender that benefit your sacred units, an extension of their magical and mythical power. What kind of bless you want really depends on your nation and your requirements. You can build a wide bless that will slightly benefit your troops, your commanders, and your god, or you can choose to go for a very specific, tailor-made bless for a certain strategy. The main thing to remember with blesses is whether they are incarnate or not. There's no point on going for a mega bless with a bunch of incarnate blesses on an imprisoned pretender. By the time they matter, it's likely you'll be in such a bad position that it's just not going to matter. So let's go through the blesses now. By pressing B on your keyboard, you can see all of the blesses available in the game. We'll go through each of them now. If you already know the blesses and you just want some bless examples, go to the timestamp below if I've remembered to add it. Otherwise, it will be in the next part in this series. So let's go over some bless broad tags. So, resistance blesses, like this fire resistance, are pretty good for sacreds. They're not as useful as they were in Dominions 5, where it was all you saw was an omni bless of resistances for every single nation in the game. But they do help your sacred stop some elemental or poison damage, which is one of the ways they can be killed easier in the mid-game. They're better the more HP your sacreds have, so they're less likely to die from spells when the resistance reduces the damage. Cold and fire resistance in Dominion 6 have the added benefit of reducing fatigue from cold or hot weather and from cold-blooded. These resists all stack with themselves and with any base resistances a unit may have. Weapon blesses, like what you can see with flaming weapons here, usually add an extra on-hit effect for your sacreds, usually adding damage and something extra that will happen as well. These are by and large more useful on multi-attack sacreds or those with ranged weapons like crossbows or bows. These weapon blesses do not affect natural ranged weapons like a dragon's breath. Statistic increases like HP, magic resist, strength, attack skill, defense skill, or precision all stack with each bless you take and increase their respective skill by 1. These can be useful small blesses to take when you have the points spare, and what's good depends on what complements your sacreds. You can use it to try and bump up some of their bad stats, or to make their good ones even better. Survival blesses, like Wasteland Survival here, give your sacreds a survival trait, which reduces the map move costs of part moving through those provinces with that terrain type, and also reduces the unit's supply cost when they're in that terrain. They only give the benefits of the type of terrain specified, and you only get the benefits of the reduced map move if everybody else in the army isn't dragging down the map move of the army. So they're not quite as good in practice as they are on paper. If you're playing on a randomly generated map, the random map gem also creates a lot more forests and highlands than it does wastes or swamps. So some survivals are a little bit better than others. Okay, so let's go through fire blesses. For the fire bless, you've got a mixed bag of utility, defense, and damage. Superior morale does what it says on the tin. It gives +1 morale. It's not great, but it's not terrible. You can use this if you have 1 bless point left and you have nothing else to spend it on. Wasteland Survival is a quite niche selection. Wastes really aren't that common on random map gen. There is also the issue as well that it is a fire-death cross path. You require both of these paths in order to take this. And for its cost, it's just really not that good. Fire resistance gives you +5 fire resist, which is one of the more common elemental types. It's quite useful. The fact as well that it helps against heat scales and fatigue makes it one of the better resistances. Attack skill gives you +1 attack skill for your sacred. It's more expensive per point that you get than in Dominions 5, but for sacreds with an already high attack skill, it can be useful to making sure that they will bypass shields easier when they're attacking their enemies. Inspirational Presence increases your leadership by 50 and gives you inspirational +1, so your squads have +1 morale. Situationally, it's quite useful. If you have good sacred leaders already, this can be nice just to make sure your squads have higher morale. Do know as well that this increase in leaderships will not give bad commanders access to advanced formations and will not let them lead additional squads without morale penalties. Righteous Wrath gives you +3 attack, strength, and +6 morale for any sacred unit that is within 2 tiles of another of your sacred being killed. This lasts for a few battle rounds. This can be nice as a stat boost if you have cheap or summonable or plentiful sacreds, like Mictlan with their jaguars or bats. If your sacreds are really expensive, this might not be the best bless to take, as it relies on you losing sacreds in order to benefit from it. Now we'll move on to the Incarnates for fire. So, Death Explosion. It's mostly just a meme, to be quite honest. It can be really funny on nations like Tianxi with their sacred ancestor spirits, where you just spirit bomb the enemy with flying sacred spirits that explode. It's also quite funny on Maverni's sacred boars, especially if you can get them flying as well. But the damage isn't good enough for me to really recommend it. And not only that, but most likely you'll be hitting your own sacreds with these explosions as well if you have them in a decent sized squad. Heat Aura gives your units a heat aura that will exhaust and potentially light enemies on fire around them, and also gives them +10 heat resistance. It can be good if you already have high heat scales or are already fire resistant. Do note that this will affect sacred priests and mages too, so do be careful with your own troops if you take this or any of the other kind of auras. Fire Shield gives your sacreds a fire shield that surrounds them. Anybody attempting to strike them will take up to 7 armor-piercing damage, which is reduced by the length of their weapon. This can be pretty decent if you have a lot of already tanky sacreds, so they can do damage if the enemy does hit them. Mostly useful as a way of clearing out chaff. Flaming Weapons gives you an additional 8 fire damage on all attacks, except natural range attacks like Dragon's Breath. It's quite good on sacreds with lots of attacks, or on archers for free fire arrows. Unbearable Splendor requires an Astral Cross, as well as fire, and requires anyone striking your sacred units to make a magic resistance check, and if they do not pass, they will be blinded. Blinded units get a massive penalty to their attack and defense skill, and they're much less likely to hit you in the future. Again, it's useful on tanky sacreds so they can take the hits, or numerable ones, so the first wave will blind all your enemies, and then your still living people will be able to kill the rest. Moving on to Air Blesses. Air Blesses are mostly utility, but there are some damaging ones too. Precision gives a stacking +1 precision, meaning ranged or magic using sacreds are more likely to hit their target with their spells or ranged attacks. I actually rate this stat quite highly. A stat increase of 1 for precision is worth more than attack skill, due to precisions of 15 or above being uncommon within the game. The baseline is 10, so if precision only costs 1 bless point for +1 precision, in comparison to, say, attack or defense, which costs 2 for 1, you're getting a fairly good deal. It can be a way of making sure that you're using all available bless points if you have nothing else to spend on. Shock of Resistance is another resistance bless. Lightning damage is actually quite scary, and usually does either high single target damage, or it has a large AoE of chaining damage, so resistance can be good against it. Far Shot increases the range of Sacred's ranged attacks by 30%. It's not the best, but you can make some funny builds in it, especially if you use it on someone like Early Age Agartha and their rock throwers. Awareness gives your Sacreds unsurroundable, which means they have to take more attacks in order to start taking harassment penalty. For this level of awareness, they have to take an additional 2 attacks before they will start taking harassment penalty. This is good if they are defense skill tanks like, say, elves usually are. Swiftness gives you plus 30% combat speed and +1 defense skill. So your Sacreds move faster and are also more likely to hit in combat first. It is quite expensive at 4 points though. Stormflight gives your Sacreds the ability to fly through storms in battles without penalty. This is only useful if they can already fly. Overall, this is quite a niche pick. You have to already be planning to be casting a lot of storms for this to be useful. For the Incarnates, Windwalker increases your map move by 6, and it's actually very useful if you have Sacred Cavalry that already have a very high map move. For infantry, it's not as impressive, especially for things like heavy infantry, like say Abyssia. They'll probably only be able to move one province most of the time. Weightlessness is an interesting one. You ignore half of your armor's encumbrance for fatigue purposes, but that doesn't include spellcasting. And you also gain floating so you can't get hit by things like earthquakes. And mounts with weightless riders don't have an encumbrance penalty for having the rider. It does require an earth cross pass, and it does cost 6 bless points. It's quite expensive for what it does. Could be quite useful though on nations that say have high protection, mounted sacreds that they don't want to fatigue out. Air Shield gives you an 80% chance of negation from incoming missiles. This is situationally useful for low protection sacreds or mages. If you have this much air though, you're gonna have access to Air Shield for your army. You're just relying on research. You're probably better off getting some protection, but there are niche uses for it. Thunder Weapons is a weapon enhancement. It gives you 1 armor negating damage and 3 armor negating fatigue damage. It used to stun enemies as well, I'm pretty sure, but it doesn't anymore. This can again be pretty good for multi-attack sacreds for racking up the fatigue damage, and also eventually you're going to take a lot of armor negating damage as well. Charged Body means that your unit will unleash a 20 armor negating shock attack against an attacker when you're struck. You also take 5 armor negating shock damage. This can be useful if you have a lot of cheap sacreds that are easily replaced. Most of the time summons. Flight gives your sacreds the ability to fly when blessed. This can be quite scary for attacking rear knights or for suddenly Maverni's 200 flying boars trampling all over you. The unfortunate thing about this is this does not allow them to fly on the map. It's only within the battle. For water, we have Winter's Gift, which requires water and a cold scale, which means that sacreds now ignore snow move penalties. It's not that great. Most nations that already like cold scales usually have snow move, and the penalties for it are usually about 1 per part move, so you're probably looking at a penalty of 2, maybe 4. I don't think this is really worth it. Can be situational though if you know that it's going to let your guys move an additional province per turn, but that's hard to determine. Swamp Survival is pretty weak. You need a nature and a water path, which is 2 great paths that you want to take anyway, but swamps aren't that common in the normal random map generator. The less supply usage can be useful for things like sieges, and these provinces usually do have less supplies, but you could equally as well just create a bag of endless wine if you needed to. Cold resistance is useful. A lot of cold damage from evocation and freezing effects can quite badly affect your sacreds, and also it means that you'll take less fatigue for fighting in cold environments. Swimming lets your sacreds go through rivers, like cross them no matter what the temperature is between the 2 provinces, and they move almost unhindered underwater and don't get as much penalties as they otherwise would. It does, however, not give water breathing. You'll need to give that from a different source. It's very situational in my mind. Good if you have a niche use for it, or if you have, say, a pretender that allows you to take lots of troops under the water and you want to take a bunch of sacreds. But again, very niche. Defense skill is pretty good at making your sacreds tankier by just not letting them get hit as much. However, with the amount of indies now, harassment penalties will most likely reduce their defense skill to near 0 anyway. This is good on elves, or good with units with unsurroundable, and units that already have very high defense skill. Onto the Incarnates. Chill Aura is similar to Heat Aura, but instead of fire resistance it gives cold resistance 10, and it can immobilize surrounding enemies by freezing them rather than setting them on fire. It's less useful in my mind, and undead are usually cold resistant anyway, but it can be very useful against cold-blooded units like Abyssians or Agarthans. Slowing Weapons is another weapon's effect, but it reduces the combat speed of those hit by 50% and gives -2 to attack and defense. This is useful because it actually gives you a greater difference between your attack and defense skill than there was previously, which means if you're using this on, say, Sacreds that already have high attack skill, then it's much harder for the enemy to defend themselves. Useful if you can already hit whatever target you're hitting already, and you just don't want to get hit quite as much and want to hit a little bit easier. Vitriol Weapons is a water-fire cross path, and it's another weapon bless, but it's quite interesting in my mind if you have the Pretender paths. 7 armor-piercing acid damage is actually quite nice, and not many things will have resistance to this. Not only that, but you have a chance of damaging the armor of whoever you hit. However, it does cost 8 bless points, so you need to make sure that you're taking on Sacreds that can make the most use out of it. This will mostly be on things like ranged Sacreds or Sacreds with multi-attack. Water breathing gives all of your Sacreds the ability to breathe water. They can cross rivers, enter the sea. They do not need to be blessed in order to do this. They will, however, still take malices for being underwater if they are not already amphibious, or at very least per amphibious. If you are going to take this for your Sacreds, you probably also want to take swimming. It can be useful to surprise sea nations because they will not be expecting you to walk underneath, but it's a very niche selection. Maybe if you already know the map, if you're playing in a multiplayer game and you know you're surrounded by underwater nations, you could use this if you have good Sacreds. Otherwise, probably put it in a situational bit. Frost Mist weapons require you to have at least 1 cold scale, and it creates a cloud of intense cold. This is actually really good on Sacred Archers because the clouds will linger for a while, doing a little bit of damage. Also, it can be very useful if you have multi-attack melee Sacreds and you're fighting someone who really hates sitting in the cold or has really bad cold resistance. What comes to mind is any of the cold-blooded nations, Satis, Agartha, or Abyssia. Quickness needs magic and is a very expensive bless. It does let your Sacreds attack twice per round, and they do get +2 to their attack and defense roll. And this is of course fantastic, especially on multi-attack Sacreds, but it is very costly both in terms of design points and the fact you need Water 9. Some research, you can just cast this with Water Mages anyway, in a low area of effect quite early on into the game. So unless you're planning on having your Pretender awake with quickness to do a very quick rushdown, which is a perfectly legitimate strategy, you might want to look elsewhere. Now we'll move on to Earth. So first in Earth we have Mountain Survival. This is actually one of the more useful survival skills because highlands and mountains are much more common than swamps or wastelands, but it's still not great. There's a lot of units that already have Mountain Survival, in which case it could be an idea to pick up if your Sacreds do not have it for some reason, but usually nations that have it will already have it on their Sacreds. Your mileage may vary, we'll put it that way. It's alright for 1 point. Reinvigoration costs 2 bless points for 1 additional fatigue recovery per round. In my opinion, this is super useful for all Sacreds, just to reduce the fatigue penalties they take. To put it in perspective, without buffs, just taking 1 point of reinvigoration doubles your fatigue loss every round, as long as your units are blessed. It is also really good for mages, especially mages that can join communions and be blessed. Strength of the Earth gives you +1 strength. That means your weapons will do more damage. This is a fairly cheap bless, at only 2 points, and it does stack. Useful for Sacreds that already hit a lot or have multi-attack, so they do more damage per hit. Unbreakable is situationally great. 75% protection from afflictions is great for tanky Sacreds that will last for the whole game. It would also be really good for Pretenders, but they already get affliction resistance from being at Earth 4. So don't just take it for your Pretender. If you've already got Earth 4, don't worry about Unbreakable. You want to take this for your actual Sacreds themselves. Things like Anakites or your large Nephil giants, people you don't want to have afflictions. Larger is another situational bless. It's good because you get more strength, map move, and HP. It does lessen your defense skill by 1, but it increases your size by 1. This can be bad because depending on what your size is to start with, if it's 5 or under, this will lower your attack density that you can get within a square. If you're already 6 or above, There's not really a downside other than you can't have somebody else stand in the square with you. Say if you went from size 7 to size 8, you suddenly can't have a human next to you. It's also very expensive at 7 bless points with an Earth and Nature cross path, but at least it's not incarnate. So if you have a build for this where you want to have incredibly big tanky sacreds, this is a good idea for you. Just make sure to watch out for archers. As for Earth Incarnates, we have Reconstruction. Reconstruction is like regeneration, but only for inanimate units like statues. Very, very niche. You need to have sacred statues for this to be good, but it's really good for some nation like Middle Age Agartha. Resilience of the Earth gives you plus 10 fire and shock protection, which is good in that it only costs you 6 bless points in order to get this, whereas if you took all the stat blesses individually, that would cost a total of 8, and you only need the one path in Earth. Hard Skin is very good. It's basically become the de facto choice if you have a expansion pretender that relies on fear or its protection in order to stay alive. It really helps you when expanding, especially against the new independent numbers. It also has the benefit of making all of your sacred units and mages more tanky with just a bless. You don't need to spend time casting, say, Stone Skin on them. They've already got the plus 5 natural protection. They'll be fine. Fortitude is quite an expensive bless at 7 bless points, but it does mean that all of your sacreds will take half damage from piercing, slashing, and blunt weapons. This is really good for already tanky sacreds, as this is what you're going to be facing the majority of in the early game. So if you have sacreds with a high pool of HP, or who already have a high protection so the damage coming through won't be very much, or sacreds that regenerate, this can be a great one to pick. Again, have a think of the cost and see if you can get anything better. Moving on to Astral, we have Arcane Command. Arcane Command gives you plus 25 magic leadership. For 1 bless point, that's pretty great. You need to be able to already lead magical beings around, but that means your mages can move more summons around much easier than they otherwise would be able to. Especially when it comes to your low level mages. It means that you can use your mages for more important things like rituals, forging items, being with your armies, rather than using them to ferry troops around your land. Magic resistance is also quite useful. You get plus 1 magic resistance for just 2 bless points, and it makes all of your blessed units slightly less vulnerable to magic. It can be really useful if you have, say for example, sacred thugs, so they can't get soul slayed quite as easily. Spirit Sight is now arguably very useful. It is an Astral Death cross, but it means that you have perfect dark vision, you can see invisible units, and you ignore glamour effects like mirror image or blur. This is a really good bless to take with a new cave layer and the fact that they have added glamour into the game. This is a must if you're going up against elves, in my opinion. Otherwise, if it's just elves and you're not worried about fighting underneath the ground, you can take the glamour version, but we'll go over that in a bit. Solar weapons is an interesting one. It's a solar fire cross path, which means that all of your attacks get an additional 4 armor piercing damage. This damage is tripled against undead and demons after protection. And this affects all weapons, including archers. So if you have sacred archers, let's say that you're Ind or Pycon, and you know that you're going to be fighting against either Lemuria or Armor, this could be a good idea. Otherwise, it's a little bit niche. It's not bad for 4 points. I quite enjoy Farcaster personally. It only costs 4 bless points, and it makes it so that for your blessed units, all of their combat spells have a much greater range than usual, plus 50%. If you're playing someone, for example, Middle Age I actually really rate this. It turns your Iron Blizzards into very long-range spells, so that you can keep your guys at the back, well defended from enemy reprisal. Arcane Finesse is also quite good. Sacreds that want to cast spells that like to check against magic resistance, things like Soulslay, Mindburn, and some battlefield-wide spells like Winds of Death, do really benefit from plus 1 magical penetration. And that's not the easiest stat to get, so if you can stack it from somewhere like this for just 4 bless points, it's pretty good. For Incarnates for Astral, we have Magic Weapons. Magic Weapons gives all of your sacreds magical weapons. This means you can ignore things like Ethereal, Mist Form, or other common low-level research thugging tactics. It's really useful for your sacred troops so that you can get an answer to things that your troops otherwise wouldn't be able to hurt. This is a must take if you're in early age and against Therados, or in the late age and against Lemuria. Twist Fate is actually also really good. I quite rate this quite highly. It lets your sacreds ignore the first successful attack against them. So if your sacreds are already hard to hit, this is great. It means the one hit that gets through will be completely ignored. This also has the interesting fact that you're more likely to hit your enemy first than they are to hit you first. And when it comes to a lot of one-on-one or square-to-square situations, the side that hits first, even if it doesn't outright kill, will probably win the engagement. If they have killed the person, great, another unit will have to come in to take its place. Or if they haven't, they've wounded them and probably reduced their combat effectiveness quite a bit. Not only that, but it can be quite useful, especially in small squad sizes, to make sure that you don't have to take the squad morale check for one of your guys just being wounded. Twist Fate can sometimes save you from that. Fate Weaving is not my favourite, to be honest, purely because you just have to take a misfortune scale, and I really do not like this misfortune scales in Dominion 6. And it also requires that your sacreds need to be hit for this to take effect. This could be really useful on tanky sacreds already, just so that you curse everybody with ill luck around you, but you should probably be working out how not to be hit or how to kill the enemy beforehand, rather than relying on yourself getting hit in order for it to trigger. At least in my mind. Etherealness is good. It is a decent bless. It is very expensive. 8 bless points, and you need to have 2 magic scales. That is a lot of design points in order to even just take this. But it does mean that your blessed units will be very hard to harm with non-magical damage, 75% chance to negate, and they can move through solid walls, so it makes sieges a lot easier. The problem that you have with this is you're paying a lot of bless points, a lot of design points in order to take this, and I do feel that magic weapons is really quite good at the moment, and a lot of opponents will take it, which means you've just kind of wasted this. Okay, let's move on to death. So first of all, we have for death, we have Undying. Undying lets your units continue the fight if they pass below 0 HP, but they're still within their Undying threshold. And you get 2 of those thresholds per level. This is really good on human sacreds because it gives you so much more value from them due to their low HP levels, and it's easier to stack up than HP is anyway. The sacred will die after the battle, however, unless they have some way to regenerate the damage they took, so they're above 0 HP. Regeneration, Undying, anything that gives you regeneration and Undying is a pretty scary combo. Undead Command gives all of your sacred commanders plus 50 undead leadership, and it gives them the bonus even if the commander can't lead undead already. This is quite good on something like, say, Scalaria, or any nation that wants to summon lots of demons, so that you make sure that you have your priests able to move around demons or undead around your land. It doesn't have any use if you're not summoning undead or any demons, however. Half Dead is interesting. It requires 2 death scales, which isn't nearly as bad in Dominion 6 as it was in Dominion 5. It means your sacreds get disease resistance plus 80 and don't need to eat, so they don't use supplies. The disease resist is quite nice, especially for old sacred mages, but given that you do need to take death 2 for it, I still have a little bit of a hang up on it. It's probably I'm wrong. It's probably actually pretty decent now, given that death scales don't affect you as much. I think there's other ways you can get disease resistance now that are probably better. Mending Bones means that your undead sacreds heal afflictions outside of battle, which is pretty useful for those with undead sacreds. It's completely useless for those who do not. Withering Weapons is another weapon enchantment, where when hit, the enemy needs to take a magic resistance check, or else they will start to decay, age, and take damage. This is nasty against humans and Abyssians or anything with a low lifespan, but it's not so good against giants or pale ones. Okay, Incarnates for death. So we have Stygian Flesh, which grants you 10 invulnerability against normal attacks, which is kind of like natural protection, but they don't stack together. This is really good for sacreds without armor, or those with no natural protection, and you just need to bump up their stats a little bit. If they are attacked by anything with magical weapons, or any kind of magical damage, they do not get this 10 invulnerability, however. So it kind of loses out to hard skin or other ways of getting protection in that respect. Reforming Flesh lets undead sacreds get regeneration plus 10%, which does also stack from other sources, but it has no use for non-undeads. It's very nation dependent. Not many nations get access to Sacred Undead. Reanimators give Sacreds a 50% chance when you kill a living unit to rise it as a soulless to then fight for your side in a battle. It can be useful as a surprise. You killed their troops and now they fight for me kind of thing. But a soulless is a soulless. It's not particularly great. It's mostly just there for the harassment penalty. It's not that great. It does give you +5 undead leadership as well, which isn't bad. Death weapons gives your weapons an additional 2 armor negating damage, which MR negates, and you have potential to disease the target you've hit, which they can also MR negate as well. These can really screw your opponent up even if you lose the battle, if you just have hit their pretender or a lot of their good mages or thugs, and now they're all diseased and are just going to die over time. And if they have no way of curing that, that's very annoying. Additionally, this is very nasty if you have any sacreds with bows or any kind of ranged attack. If you really want to be cheeky about it, give your independent priests a bless and bows of war and send them out with this. Your opponent will hate it. Fear gives all sacreds fear level 5. This is quite strong, but it is expensive. This also stacks with any fear that those units have already. Even at fear 5, you can put your sacreds in amongst other troops during your expansion, and it will cause indie squads to retreat. Overall, even though it is quite expensive, I do actually rate this quite highly. Moving on to nature, we have resilience, which gives you 1 HP. This is mostly useful for using up leftover points in your bless, but you can use it tactfully in order to get over to the next level of 10. So for example, going from 29 HP to 30, which will then make it so that you have an additional 1 HP regen if you have 10% regeneration. Low light vision gives your sacreds partial dark vision. It's okay, but nature already has quite a lot of easy access to dark vision at fairly low research. So it can be useful if you just have a point to use, but your mileage may vary. Poison resistance is quite nice. Lots of units now have access to poison damage, there's a lot of poison spells. The envenomed arrows that you have now can be very scary, but on the same token, it's maybe not quite as a immediate take as it was in Dominions 5. Fouled Vapors was nerfed, people aren't slinging it around left, right and centre. If you have no easy way or natural way in order to buff your sacred's poison resistance, I would take it. If you do, then probably just leave it at home. Forest survival is probably actually the most useful of all the survival traits. There's quite a bit more forest than there are any other type of terrain other than farmland and plains when it comes to random map generation. Still, your mileage may vary, and for a lot of commanders, you can craft forest survival gear fairly early on with little research, so it's really only useful for your troop sacreds rather than your commanders. Unaging requires magic 1 and makes it so your sacreds only age for 1 year for every 4. It's good for nations that have old sacred mages, middle-aged Shinyama or any Abyssia comes to mind, but I would say this is quite niche. Poison weapons require death 1, which again isn't quite as bad as it was in Dominions 5, and gives an additional 5 poison damage to your weapon. This is very good on archers, but nature already has a way of giving them poison attacks on their bows. It's good on multi-attack units, and I mean it's extra damage, you can't really complain, and it means that your enemy needs to have poison resistance in order to do anything against it. Moving on to the Incarnates. So recuperation lets your units heal battlefield afflictions over time. This is good for sacreds that are quite tanky, so that if they do get afflictions, they can get rid of it. Do note it doesn't work on undead, lifeless, or spirit form beings. It needs to be on regular living folk. Berserker is an interesting one. It's hard to recommend. I've always had a bit of a soft spot for it. It means that all of your sacreds get Berserker +2, so if they get hit, they have a chance of going berserk. It means that they'll get extra protection, extra attack skill, they'll take more fatigue per battle round, then they have less defense skill, but they also won't run away, which is very, very useful. Really good on your sacred troops, but it means that any of your sacred commanders also get Berserk, so if they are hit by single sling, they have a chance of going Berserk, which means they'll go off script and just charge straight in, and if you have a 490 gold capital only mage go Berserk, you're not going to be happy. Bark Skin is an interesting one, so it gives you +7 natural protection to a maximum of 10. It has no effect on ethereal units, and it's fairly costly at 6 nature. It's good on sacreds with good protection, but no natural protection to make them even tankier. Do know about the reduction in fire resistance, and have a little think to yourself whether or not you would prefer hard skin over something like bark skin, which doesn't have the maximum amount of natural protection it can provide. Regeneration is an expensive bless, but it is good on tanky sacreds with high HP pools. Do note this also stacks with personal regeneration for some of your casters, which means that you can get to quite ridiculous level of regeneration for some of the giant nations, or if you have a pretender with a lot of HP. Let's move on to Glamour, which is my favourite new path, although that's not saying much. Undreaming gives you +4 magic resistance against attacks that will send you to sleep. Good if you're going up against Glamour nations, but it's quite niche. Heroism is quite strong at the moment, and you've probably seen community posts about this already. It gives 50% more experience for your sacred troops, and it can be stacked up to 5 times for 5 bless points. 200% extra experience means that you're going to be getting your troops and your commanders to 5 stars very quickly, and you'll also be filling up the Hall of Fame. This means you'll be getting lots of increases to their stats, their leadership, their research ability. It's a very good, it's a very cheap bless. Quiet Stride gives sacreds +20 stealth, only useful if they are already stealthy. Elves is your calling, as much as I hate to say it. True Sight is what I kind of mentioned earlier when we were talking about Spirit Sight. It's cheaper than Spirit Sight, it doesn't require the cross path as well, but it doesn't let you see in the dark. It's still useful for ignoring illusions and glamour effects. Blur is very good for just 3 bless points and 3 points in your glamour path. Attacking units attacking your blessed units have their attack skill reduced by 2 unless they have some form of Spirit Sight, True Sight, or if they're already blind. This is pretty cheap and useful, especially because usually your sacreds will have better defense skill than normal troops would anyway. So reducing somebody with bad attack skill down means they're much less likely to beat your good sacred's defense skill. Can be quite useful to stack this with other things as well. Moving on to Incarnates. So Obfuscate is an interesting bless. This makes your sacred stealthy if they weren't already, and if they were, they get +40 to their stealth, which makes them very hard to spot. This is all sacreds, so suddenly you can now recruit independent priests, and they're now stealthy preachers. This could cause some shenanigans in multiplayer, I'm very much assuming. Just keep an eye on your Dominion and see if it's going down every turn, just in case somebody has an Obfuscate bless. Awe is a Glamour and Fire cross path, but it is quite good in that it costs 8 bless points, but it's on 2 different paths. So it means that in terms of your designer points, it probably won't cost quite as much than, say, if you had to get Glamour 8. Looking over it as well, you get Awe +3 rather than just say Awe +1 like you used to get. This means that in order to hit you, attackers now need to make a morale check, and if they fail that morale check, then they just don't hit you, and they've just wasted their turn. This is very good on glass cannon sacreds. Just give them some kind of defense that isn't reduced by harassment, or weakens them with our low HP pools. But it is also quite useful on higher HP secrets. If you can take this, and you have a reason to on your troops, all is good. It's always been good. Just don't rely on it versus Berserkers. Displacement is kind of like Blur, but instead of reducing the attacker's attack skill by 2, it's now reduced by 5, which does swing things quite a lot. This is really good for expanding against independents, as they will really struggle to hit your sacreds with this, regardless of the harassment penalty. Because when you get militia hitting on 3s, it's not that much different from 0. Dread now gives you +5 Dread, which is slightly different from Fear. It now has a new icon in the feature panel. And from my testing that I've done over Fear to try and understand Radius and how it works, they no longer seem to stack together. I don't know if that was intentional, or if that was a bug to do with the new separation of the Dread mechanics. I'm going to do some more testing about that and come back to it. If you don't have fear on your sacreds, Dread's fine. Dread's good. It does the exact same thing fear does, it's slightly cheaper. The only issue is that if units can see through illusions, like using True Sight or by using Spirit Sight, then they're not affected. But to be fair, those probably aren't the things you're trying to scare away anyway. It's mostly independence, I would imagine. Luck requires luck 2, but it's really nice for human sacreds that will die easier than giants. If you have sacreds that don't really want to die, or have things that happen when they do die, Nidvangar's new sacreds come to mind for this, in that this will trigger every time they're going to use a soul scar, then this can be very good. Let's move on to blood. So for blood, you have strong Vitae, which gives you 1 HP, exactly the same benefits as resilient, except now it requires a blood path of 1 rather than nature path of 1. Strength of the flesh gives you +1 strength, exactly the same as the earth strength increase. These can stack together so you can get up to a total of +10 strength, which is again very funny on Agarth and rock throwers. Try out one time when you get a chance. Strong blood gives all of your sacreds +5 poison resistance and +80 disease resistance at all time. I think this is much better than something like Half Dead if you have blood on your pretender. Obviously if you don't, then go for Half Dead. But this in my mind is much better. The poison resistance is nice, and the disease resistance is nice. It also doesn't require your sacreds to be blessed for this to happen, so it'll just happen at all times, including assassinations. Enchanted Blood is a new one, and it's quite interesting in a sense, in that blessed units will regenerate 0.5 HP per round, and they get +1 magic resistance, and it stops them from profuse bleeding, which is one of the ways that your big, large pretenders like Ursnet can die if they get a profuse bleeding affliction, despite their affliction resistance. This makes it really good for humans, and not only that, actually really good for units that are less than a human. If they didn't have enough hit points to get above the 10 mark, then they really struggle with regeneration, whereas a flat 0.5 HP per round is great. Also really good for units with Undying. If you get this and Undying and the unit is at its negative health pool but hasn't fully died yet, because of the time after the battle, they can use this to regen up so they won't die. Pretty good. Blood Surge gives +3 attack and strength and +1 reinvigoration defense if a blessed sacred kills a living enemy. It's quite good on paper, but it's not as good as it was in Dominions 5. It does seem to time out after a couple of rounds, and it isn't refreshed on your kills. It's good for swarms of sacreds though, just to bump up their stats a little bit, but I don't rate it quite as highly as I did in Dominions 5. For Incarnate Blesses, Blood Bond spreads out half of the incoming damage to a sacred to all other blessed units within 5 squares. This is good on things like giants with regeneration so that they can't individually be burst down by big spells. It's also really good if you like to watch vast swathes of human sacreds die all at once. Unholy Weapons give you 10 armor-piercing damage that only affects other pretenders and their sacred troops. This will affect, again, all of your normal weapons and ranged weapons. It effectively turns your sacreds into anti-sacred sacreds. Again, useful on nations with sacreds with a bunch of multi-attacks or ranged attacks. Blood Vengeance requires the attacker to roll a magic resistance check when they damage a blessed unit. Otherwise, they're going to take an equal amount of damage, which is good if you have a bunch of numerous or tanky sacreds so that you can potentially kill enemy mages when they cast spells. Finally, Vampiric Weapons gives you 3 armor negating drain damage when you hit your enemies. These will also heal your sacreds for as much damage as they do, making these very good on high HP multi-attack sacreds. Okay, and with that we've gone through all the blesses in the game. I was going to talk about bless builds in this video, I think this has already gone on long enough. In the next part, we're going to make some example pretenders and bless builds for some nations, just so you can get an idea of what thought process you can go through when you're designing your own. Thank you for watching, and until next time, take care.